As America approaches its 250th anniversary, we often revisit the Founding Fathers as political figures. But according to Harvard professor Joyce Chaplin, one of the most famous Founding Fathers was also America's first climate scientist. In her latest book, The Franklin Stove, An Unintended American Revolution, she tells the story of Benjamin Franklin. Yes, a statesman, but also a man of science, a relentless experimenter who solved real-world problems. During the brutally cold winter of 1740 to 1741, Franklin noticed homes across Pennsylvania burning extraordinary amounts of firewood just to stay warm. Forests were disappearing, energy was being wasted, and he saw an environmental and economic crisis taking shape. His solution? The now famous Franklin stove. But here's the twist. Did his invention actually save energy in the long run? What does it reveal about the roots of our modern techno-optimism? And what can Franklin's approach teach us about confronting the wicked problem of climate change? Stay tuned as we dive into all of this with Dr. Joyce Chaplin, professor of early American history at Harvard University, where she teaches the histories of science, climate, colonialism, and the environment. She is a former Fulbright Scholar and a leading expert on Benjamin Franklin, as well as the author and editor of multiple books, including a major biography of Benjamin Franklin himself. Hi, Dr. Chaplin. Thank you so much for being a guest on our podcast today. We're very excited to interview you today.
Thank you so much, Parina. It's great to be here.
Congratulations on your latest book, The Franklin Stove, An Unintended American Revolution, for which you received a Guggenheim Fellowship. You've described this project as an essay that got a bit out of hand. What is the story behind that?
Right. So I actually had done quite a bit of work on Franklin in earlier projects. And I was convinced I was done. I'd done everything that I found interesting about him. But for another project, I was reading about the Little Ice Age, this period of cooling, hemispheric, we don't think global, but unusually cool weather that affected Europe and North America, at the very least, parts of Asia as well. Within this, I was reading about this very bad winter of 1740 to 1741, and that was sort of interesting and news to me, but I kept thinking, I know those dates from somewhere, 1740, 1741, and then I realized that that was when Franklin had invented his stove, his famous stove. And I thought, well, I wonder whether there's more to this story about the bad weather and a desire to keep warm or warmer. So I started looking into it thinking, well, I missed this in my book and that was silly, but at least I could, write an interesting little essay about it. And the little essay got out of hand because I kept making all of these discoveries about other things Franklin had done in relation to heating and his stove. So yes, it was originally supposed to be one little essay or article, and it grew into a book, a fairly long book, though I've got to say it could have been longer. I feel like there's a lot more to say to the story, so I welcome other historians coming back to this information and finding out more about this part of Franklin's life in science that I'd really missed the first time around. So yeah, an essay that got out of hand.
Yeah, Franklin has surely done a lot. And you've already mentioned the background a little bit, but can you describe more like what was going on specifically in that context and what drove Franklin to develop his stove in response to those conditions of the climate crisis at that time?
It's interesting that at the time, no one really disputed that it was cold. The denialism was different. I don't want to say it didn't exist, but everyone was like, it is really cold, and this is bad. There was debate about whether it might get better and whether people could do something to make it better. So that was going on as well at the time, that there were these background natural events and a lot of puzzlement about what was causing them and what might end, or at least make the bad weather go away for a while. In the meantime, there was a lot of concern about keeping warm. And within Europe, this intersected with concern about fuel giving out. So since the Middle Ages, really, Europeans had been deforesting a lot of their natural environments. Wood hadn't completely disappeared, but in some areas it was prohibitively expensive. colonists in North America were starting to do this. Decades before Franklin was born, within a very short period of time after the settlement of Boston, the city really had no wood left. And actually, Boston kept getting its wood from further and further away until in the 19th century, they're really getting it from Canada. These are the concerns that Franklin himself has, shared with a lot of other people, that the weather was pretty consistently cold, and then every once in a while, just crazy weather events, really bad winters, poor harvests, droughts, hot spells just sprinkled in at random to make things really kind of unpredictable. And no one had a good theory about what was going on. It's interesting that we still don't really understand why the Little Ice Age occurred, as the period was called. So I should have said, this is a period of hemispheric cooling lasting from about 1300 to around 1850. And again, notably cooler weather, some extremely cold winters where the conditions are such that harvests fail, people cannot buy enough fuel. Either they can't get it or they can't afford it. And so these are the background conditions that I hope I've explained enough about why Franklin, but a lot of other people were worried.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that background. And now you describe the Franklin stove as a hypothesis, as an attempt to invent a way out of a climate crisis. And you also write that its story shows that there's no magic bullet, that climate change is not a technical problem, but it's a social and a political problem with a long history. So can you talk about how these ideas fit together and what they reveal about the roots of our modern techno-optimism?
Yes, well, it is exactly from Franklin's era that we get our techno-optimism. This is a moment where people talked enthusiastically about enlightenment, about improvement, about the way human knowledge could be improved. People's technical capacities could get more sophisticated, and people could invent their way out of various problems. And I don't want to say that that's impossible, and we are crazy to have any confidence in that. It's just that technology is more complicated, and it's not just the physical devices themselves, and it's not just their inventors. Technology is always connected back to the societies and the individuals who generate it, reflecting their concerns, their priorities, their prejudices. And so technology never will really solve an entire problem unless there's real understanding of what a society is doing, what its priorities are, and how technology needs to be slotted into a broader spectrum of solutions, societal as well as technical. So I don't think that Franklin's era and our era are absolutely identical, and we can generate a blueprint for getting out of our climate crisis by looking at what he was doing. But I do think it's really revealing in terms of thinking about how technology has certain wonderful capacities, and we absolutely need to invest in and think about it, but that societally, a problem like climate change is too large and too complicated only to be solved with technology.
Thank you for that explanation. That makes a lot of sense. In your book, you also note that there were 5 Franklin stoves. So can you walk us through how the project, which initially began as a stewardship effort to conserve Pennsylvania's trees, eventually led to stove designs that burned coal? And how did that shift, especially against the backdrop of the Industrial Revolution, steer American industry and society toward fossil fuel dependence?
Yes, that is the whole story of his stove project as I think of it. I mean, I think most people who know something about the Franklin stove know about the first design or the first 2 designs, maybe not even understanding that they were 2 different ones. But he did 5 that we know of. And it's perfectly possible that there were interim models or variations that he worked with other people, or that he suggested sketches that we just don't have anymore, but 5 known designs. So the first 2 were done in Pennsylvania for conservation of firewood, the main fuel source at that point. In the colonies generally, and in Pennsylvania definitely. So Franklin was afraid that, if the winters keep being very, very cold. And we keep burning up the available trees, we're going to run out. He's also looking at the way in which the colonial population of Pennsylvania is growing, and that many more consumers, burning that many more trees, not a good scenario. So he designs a fireplace insert. So really it's a kind of a box with one open side, made of iron that you slide into your existing fireplace. And this makes modification much easier, even than maybe compared to installing a heat pump. You use your existing heating system, modifying it to generate more heat with less firewood. So the iron box extends a little bit further out in the room than a fireplace would, bringing the heat further into the room. And the iron sides retain heat as you're burning something that continues to radiate outward into the room. So the heat source is, in a sense, made more immediate rather than being back in the back of a fireplace. With most of the heat going up a chimney, this is still a real problem with that design of heating. That was Model 1. Model 2 was when Franklin added to this firebox that you slide into your fireplace an airbox. This is a set of metal plates inserted into the chimney that had baffles, or these grooves or wedges, extending the amount of metal surface that existed that could collect heat, again generating more that could be sent out into the room, and with a very complex system of modifications to the fireplace that were supposed to channel the hot air into the room and the smoke out the chimney. This is the optimal scenario. So firebox plus airbox. And often that's what people think of when they think of the Franklin stove. You've seen those diagrams for that setup. Now, it must be said that the iron being produced to make these modifications was itself made through consumption of yet more firewood, burned down into charcoal, used to smelt and then craft iron in the Pennsylvania Iron Works. And so already we see a very early iteration of the Industrial Revolution. We think of that Industrial Revolution as burning coal and later on petroleum. But at first, it's using an organic energy source, and in Pennsylvania, that meant yet more trees. So the trade-off, if you'd run the numbers, yes, people are keeping warmer with these fireplaces. They're having to purchase less fuel. But if everyone was going to adopt that modification, I think there are real questions about how many trees would actually be saved. Also, they weren't trees that I'd want to say belonged to Pennsylvania because they were growing on indigenous territory, especially the Lenape Nation that had been the predominant indigenous population in Pennsylvania. It's their trees. And increasingly land and everything that grows on it, or the iron ore underneath it, that land is being extracted from native populations through force and intimidation. So a problem built in. Franklin builds designs his next 3 stoves when he's living in Europe. So he designs 2 more in London and then a 3rd in Paris. So the 2 in London he develops when he is living in a house. It still exists. It's the only Franklin residence that is still standing on Craven Street in London. And he has a very, very, very forgiving landlady who lets him modify her fireplaces and drill holes in the wall so he can monitor the drafts in a room. I don't know how he explained this to her, but anyway, he gets away with that. And he builds a sliding grate system out of iron pieces at first, again, to channel hot air into a room and smoke out of it. That's his 3rd design, done in London, which he claims is very successful and other people imitate it. The 4th design was, I think, what most people might mentally think of if they're thinking about a Franklin stove, a kind of freestanding round device. Again, it can be fitted into an existing fireplace, but it has the ability to radiate heat from all sides of it and all around. And I should mention that the big development in these 2 designs was that they were made to burn coal. So there's really no available firewood unless you're extremely wealthy within England. Scotland, yes, and Ireland would still be burning peat mostly, but coal is the main fuel that Franklin can get in London, so he adopts that and advocates improved burning of coal, a kind of, in retrospect, dubious goal now that we know everything that fossil fuels are going to release into the atmosphere. The fifth and final stove, Franklin designs in Paris when he's still acting as the official ambassador, representative from the Continental Congress to the court of Louis XVI. So France has one of those intermittent bad winters, the kind that Franklin had experienced way back in 1740, 1741. This is in the 1780s, and the Paris authorities are very worried about really public order. If people are going to get cold and run out of fuel, that there won't be enough to cook food or keep warm. And the Paris authorities, bread is always a really big concern in France, let them eat cake. And so the French authorities want to prioritize the use of fuel, mostly wood, to make food, especially to bake bread. They go to Franklin, their resident heat expert, very handy that he's there, and they ask him to design an emergency grate, again, something that can fit into a fireplace, made of metal, that can burn very small amounts of coal and yet keep a room fairly warm. And so he snaps up a design, and we have existing sort of physical representations and some explanation of how it was supposed to work. As far as we know, this is the fifth and final one. I'll just note that he's never satisfied. And I think this raises real questions about whether any of these designs was, as far as he was concerned, a success, whether they worked exactly the way he described them or he wanted them to work. But anyway, it becomes this kind of 50-year project that Franklin is doing, stretching across 3 different places, involving a lot of people, members of his family, the London landlady, all these people involved, men of science who are likewise trying to experiment. So it is this 5-stove sequence that I think is really fascinating. And it raises questions. The title of my book is a lie, all right? The Franklin stove. There is no such thing. There were 5.
Yeah. It's really interesting to see how his different locations throughout his development of the stoves kind of shaped his invention.
Yeah.
And it makes sense why he was never satisfied, because he did so many developments and so many different things. Which brings me to my next question, is that Franklin was famous for his experiments with lightning and electricity. So did that same scientific mindset connect to the way he demonstrated how air and heat could move through a room?
Indeed. So I think the principle that unites a lot of his scientific interests is circulation. How forms of matter move around, what kinds of configurations they take. So he's fascinated with what in the 18th century would have been called fluid substances, meaning gases, as we might now call them. Heated air, heated water. He's eventually interested in the Gulf Stream. And how wind and water both can exhibit a kind of pattern that's thermally induced. So again, that concern with hot, cold, and flow versus stasis intersect in a lot of his different works, including electricity. So the stove is his first invention, again, that we know of. And it precedes his work with electricity by about a decade. So it is interesting that he does these experiments at home, really, right? He's trying to heat up his family's sitting room with this improved stove. And he writes up a pamphlet that is really his first scientific work. So it describes the stove. It tells you how his stove is better than everyone else's. It tells you if you order one, how it will arrive. So I love that it arrives as a flat pack, like getting something from IKEA, and then you have to put the plates together, or you need help doing that, obviously. They are very heavy, and you probably need a specialist to help construct them, but still, very kind of consumer friendly. But it is, in his explanation of how you use his device, he has footnotes to scientific works, and he really is interested in the theoretical dimensions of his very practical device. And this sets him up, I think, for doing later experiments with electricity and other things, eventually investigating the Gulf Stream, for instance. But again, that concern with circulation, with thermal variation, what is hot versus what is cold, and how that can generate movement in a fluid substance, water, air, different kinds of gases. So yes, this stove, I think, leads very, very nicely into his eventual work on electricity.
So you've said that Franklin was a man of science who was much more than that. So can you describe his place in the history of science? And also, is it ironic that, especially today when science is often under attack, that one of America's most prominent founding fathers was a scientific celebrity in his own time, and even America's first climate scientist?
It is unfortunately ironic. So here's the thing. If the American Revolution had never taken place, so there's a hypothetical, right? So if the American Revolution had never taken place, I think Franklin would have been the only one of the so-called founders who would really be historically noted and important, the only person anyone would have heard of out of that whole pantheon, because of his fame in science, which he'd established by the 1750s, certainly, when he did his electrical experiments, so 2 decades before the American Revolution. He was already a celebrity and noted in Europe as such. So there's that, that he is first and foremost a man of science. I mean, I do want to give credit to his work in the printing industry as a kind of intellectual and communicator anyway, that were intrinsic to how he thought about natural science, how to do it, how to tell people what you had discovered. But it's really his fame in science, much more than his work as a printer, that brings him to international attention and makes him into, again, a kind of icon and celebrity. Very, very fortunate for the United States and the Continental Congress that they have Franklin as this kind of weapon to deploy when they need to send someone to Europe to say, hey, pay attention to us, help us. They have one of the most famous people, certainly within science, as well as in kind of public life, where science really did have a more prominent position than it would do today. So this is, I guess, the ultimate irony, that, right, we're at a moment where in the United States, science is not as respected as it might have been in earlier eras, and yet there's a way you could argue the United States exists because they had a very famous man of science to broker international recognition for the United States and material support for it, getting the loans, getting the troops, getting the French Navy, and so on. I will mention, I want to go back to, if I may, Franklin's fifth invention, his fifth stove invention, the one he makes in Paris. The French authorities go to him right during the peace negotiations. So that is very preoccupying when Franklin is very, very busy trying to get the document right, making sure everyone is going to be happy and sign on. He doesn't have time, right, to do another little kind of design for somebody. But what is he going to say? These were the allies that really helped the United States win the war. He can't say no. And so I look at the design that he made for this little rotating grate. It's like a little space heater that you put into your fireplace and you burn a tiny lump of coal to keep warm. And it's a legacy of that interaction between Franklin's reputation as a man of science and then the public work he does for the United States. And he manages to do both at the same time.
I think it's really interesting how you say that if it wasn't for the revolution, none of the other people would have been known as much as he was, because he truly did more than just political stuff for America. He made all these science inventions, so he truly deserves all that fame. And while Franklin was developing the stove, and you've spoken about this also, is that he was managing a publishing company and printing pamphlets about his invention. So in what way did his skill as a communicator through those printed essays shape how the public understood and adopted his stove, and even grasped the climate ideas that he was proposing? And would it be fair to think of him as an early science communicator?
Very definitely. Thank you. I think that's a great way of thinking about him. That he did science. I mean, he did actual experiments, and he established principles that scientists continue to use. So, for instance, that electricity is one phenomenon, but it exists in two states, positive and negative. That's still the way physicists think of electricity. So that's pretty serious as a kind of major contribution to understanding one physical force in the universe. No, but Franklin was, I think, equally clever about explaining to people how this worked. So he could have come up with much more arcane. He could have used Latin to describe positive and negative. I don't know. He could have been deliberately arcane in describing his electrical experiments. But when he describes them, they're as letters to a kind of contact in London. And actually, he writes eventually to several other people about the electrical experiments he's doing that he describes as being sociable. He does them with three other men, I'm sorry. There's a four-man team. They're done sometimes with an audience, and very simply, with ordinary objects you yourself might have at home. And I think this is really important to him establishing a scientific reputation as saying, these are universal truths that you can find out wherever electricity might occur, wherever you're cold in a room. This is always going to work. But he does so very simply to say anyone can understand this. Anyone literate can read my pamphlet and come away with an understanding of how my stove works. Anyone can read my observations and experiments on electricity and really understand how electricity works. That's hugely important. I mean, science is much more complicated now. We have developed a lot of fields of inquiry where you have to be a specialist. But I think that the goal of explaining to a wider public what science is and why certain things are important for the public to understand, that's something that's never gone away. And I do think that Franklin's career as a printer, where he's always, to be a printer in this era was to try to, I think probably publishing now is still trying to figure out, well, what are people going to be interested in? How do I make it clear that they want to buy? My newspaper, my almanac, my little pamphlet on such and such. Well, I think it still is important to think about that. And that is definitely something that Franklin developed as a printer that he carries over into his understanding of science.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I think making it understandable to everyone is truly the key to driving climate action and making people engage with climate change and get interested in solving the climate crisis.
Yeah, I do think that it's probably important to keep thinking about multiple audiences. So again, I'm going back to how Franklin's stove pamphlet explained in everyday terms how to install his device, but then it had these footnotes, and one of them in Latin, no less. So he was really talking to two different kinds of audiences, the very ordinary practical one, and then the fellow men of science who are like, how does convection work for your stove? And you can drop down and look at the footnotes and find out, more if you want to.
Yeah. And you've touched on several pieces of the quiet technological and environmental revolution that grew out of the Franklin stove already, but can you summarize for our audience, once again, why you call it the Unintended American Revolution?
Unintended. I really do think that there are unintended dimensions to any revolution. People just don't really know what they're getting into. They may not even understand the background forces that have pushed them toward declaring a side, for instance. But I really don't think anyone planned the Industrial Revolution as a kind of, manifesto-driven, goal-orientated series of events. It kind of happened out of a lot of background factors and prompts, some of them inherited by Franklin's era, and then moving in directions that I don't think people could have necessarily predicted or understood. So way too complicated to be kind of, driven by a small group or even a generation, because it's a multi-generational, very complex project. Nevertheless, it happens. Here we are, sitting surrounded by manufactured objects, using really historically unprecedented levels of energy. So we are the belated beneficiaries, but also kind of victims of that longer-term set of material developments that really changed everyday life for people, where industrial manufacturing, large-scale extraction of energy and other things like iron ore and eventually other kinds of materials. Commercial farming, plantation agriculture for production of different kinds of goods, sugar, cotton, and so on, all tied back to this great industrial revolution that goes through different phases. And Franklin lives through and participates in the very earliest phase. So because he's an expert on how to burn things efficiently, he becomes a consult for Boulton and Watt, the inventors of the big, historically important steam engine. And that intersection as well is fascinating, that I don't think Franklin knew where steam power was going. But he's involved with this invention. So unintended, it has to be. No one has a kind of central plan. The Industrial Revolution runs in directions no one could have anticipated. The biggest unintended consequence, I think, is the generation of massive amounts of CO2 in the atmosphere. And here's where Franklin's last three stoves, the ones that burn coal, he didn't know. No one knew in this era it's interesting that he wants to reduce emissions by minimizing smoke. You don't want it in the room, and you don't actually want a lot of it to go out your chimney. So there's a kind of awareness, but they didn't know. They had no idea what burning coal itself was going to do, and what burning fossil fuels, eventually liquid in form, was going to do to transform the atmosphere and degrade the environment. So unintended.
That makes a lot of sense, and it makes sense why he made stoves to burn coal, because he didn't know that coal could do that much damage in that time.
Well, also at the moment, it seemed like coal saved trees, and it does, right? It's interesting that Pennsylvania, which Franklin's adopted colony, eventual state, becomes the heart of the first really heavy industrial revolution in the United States. I mean, it is mining coal, making first iron and then steel, immense factory ramp up and production. And the thing is, Pennsylvania also, compared with a lot of the original 13 colonies, has a really high proportion of surviving ancient forests. And that's what the coal did, right? It did prevent the wood from being burned. We now know that maybe that was a dubious trade-off.
When someone finishes the Franklin stove, what do you hope they see differently about Franklin, climate change, or even about the technologies in their own homes?
Well, I mean, I think at the moment a lot of people are not thinking about climate change. Too few people are. They aren't taking it seriously. They don't want it to impinge on their everyday life. And I do think that there might be a taste as well for reading history that doesn't talk about that unpleasantness. I actually don't understand how anyone can write a history of early America and never mention the Little Ice Age, that this is a climate background or even shaper of what happened for that history. So I just want people to think about it. That would be great, right? If people were more conscious that this is currently a really serious problem. The next thing is that I'd like people to do something about it. Make decisions that are cognizant of our energy trade-offs, and think about political action that might be necessary. Because I do feel like, we actually do have a lot of technologies now that could be solutions, will be parts of a solution to our climate crisis. It is within the United States politics that are keeping them from being used. And so this is where I feel like, technology never on its own solves the problem. There has to be a kind of societal or political framework that puts it into motion and checks problems and corrects when things don't play out as necessary. So the technology is there at the moment, or some of it, and it's not being put into motion, put into play. And I hope people would think about that as a way in which we are kind of frozen at the moment. And that is not a good way to move forward. We're not moving forward, let's just say that.
Thank you. Thank you for these insights. And moving on to my last question, what can we learn from the history of Franklin and the Franklin stove, and also Franklin's scientific curiosity that can be relevant to today's climate crisis and the politics around it?
Again, I think it's public awareness and willingness to talk about where we are and to be frank. For instance, when there's coverage, news coverage of extreme weather events, that people realize that there might be reasons why these are occurring, or worse, why the events are more extreme than they might be if we didn't have the background of global warming and climate change. So having people think about that would be great. In terms of Franklin himself, again, the curiosity, I think, is also important. I do think that public awareness of science, even unrelated to climate change, we're not in a very good place at the moment, where questioning of scientific expertise is a serious problem. That people don't have confidence in what science says, even when it's intended to be beneficial and to be helpful for people. So I think I really hope that, seeing that the United States has a past in which major characters were engaged with science, curious about the world, interested in solving problems. So I don't want to say that Franklin did it, I'm not advocating that people go back to burning wood, let alone coal. But the way in which he would look at everyday problems and improvement of life for people, that's not a bad model, not a bad way of thinking about how we might want to go forward.
Yeah, I think we can definitely learn from the past to move forward in today's climate crisis. And I think that brings us to the end of our interview. So thank you so much for joining us, and I really appreciate all the conversations that I've had with you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Parina. This is really great to talk with you. Thanks.